Imagine you are a billionaire CEO of a massive multinational corporation.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Right. So you have unimaginable wealth. You've got a private security force, an army of lawyers, and, complete unquestioned immunity from any consequences.
Basically, you can bend governments to your will.
Exactly. You are untouchable. And yet imagine a completely penniless man who lives out in the desert, somehow walks right past your security detail, stands in the middle of your lavish living room, looks you dead in the eye, and calls you a thief and a murderer.
Wow.
And instead of laughing or just, having him thrown out, you are absolutely terrified of him.
Because you know he's right.
Because he is completely right. Today, we are exploring an ancient world where exactly that kind of power dynamic played out in real time. We are launching into a brand new deep dive into a sprawling, multi-generational epic.
Yeah, we're looking at a deeply researched document titled Survey of Old Testament Monarchy by Chris R. Valansis.
And this is for you, the listener, whether you're a history buff or just fascinated by the mechanics of power.
It's a phenomenal text to unpack, really, because it forces us to grapple with the very nature of human governance.
So give us the 10,000-foot view right out of the gate. What are we actually looking at here?
Well, we are looking at a canonical and historical period that covers hundreds of years. The primary source material for this history spans the biblical books of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings.
Right, and there's a parallel telling too, right?
Yeah, exactly, alongside a parallel retelling found in 1 and 2 Chronicles.
So what's the mission of this deep dive today?
The mission is to trace a massive seismic transition in the ancient Near East. We are going to follow the nation of Israel as they transform from a loose, highly vulnerable confederation of tribes into a centralized, powerful, wealthy kingdom.
Which sounds like a success story, but
it's not. Because we'll watch how that kingdom tragically fractures in two, and then we'll examine the brutal historical and theological reasons why both halves ultimately collapsed into ash and rubble under the crushing weight of foreign empires.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we look at the specific kings or the timelines, I want you, the listener, to put yourself in the shoes of someone living in the ancient Levant, roughly 3,000 years ago.
Right. Picture the landscape.
You are tasked with building a society completely from scratch. You have hostile neighbors on every side who actively want to take your land and your resources.
It's a high-stakes environment.
Incredibly high stakes. So how do you actually balance power? How do you create an institution, a government, that is strong enough to protect your borders and your family, but not so strong that it eventually turns inward and crushes its own citizens?
Yeah, that is the exact tightrope this entire history is trying to walk.
It's fascinating.
And it's the ultimate enduring question of political science, really. What this historical survey argues, and it argues it relentlessly chapter after chapter, is that human kingship in this specific context succeeds only when it is entirely subordinated to divine authority.
So it's not just a dry history book.
Absolutely not. This isn't just a political ledger of who won which battle. The authors compiling this history had a very specific, uncompromising lens.
They have a point to make.
They do. They are presenting a theological history. They are exploring the inevitable corruption that follows unchecked power. And they're establishing a metric for ultimate accountability.
Which brings us to the exact moment this all kicks off. We are dropping into the book of 1 Samuel, specifically chapter 8.
A hugely pivotal moment.
Yeah, the backdrop here is crucial. Israel has been operating in this period of the judges. They don't have a king. They don't have a centralized government or a standing army.
They're just a loose confederation of 12 tribes.
And it is chaotic. It is dangerous. Because right next door, you have the Philistines. And the Philistines have iron weapons, they have chariots, and they have centralized leadership.
A massive technological and military advantage.
Exactly. So the elders of Israel come to the prophet Samuel, who is basically their spiritual and judicial leader, and they make a demand. They say, give us a king. Now, reading through the source material, the biblical text treats this request like it is a catastrophic betrayal.
It really does.
And I have to admit, reading this from a modern, practical perspective, it's confusing. I mean, I'm looking at the map of the ancient Near East here. Literally all the surrounding nations, the Philistines, the Arameans, the Moabites, the Ammonites, they all have kings.
Yeah, it's the standard model of governance.
Right. So from a pure survival standpoint, Israel asking for a king isn't a rebellion. It's just basic national security. They are trying to modernize their government so they don't get wiped off the map. Why is the text treating a military upgrade like high treason?
Well, it's a completely irrational question, and understanding the answer unlocks the entire paradigm of the Old Testament.
Okay, lay it on me.
What's fascinating here is that the demand is offensive because it is explicitly theological, even if the Israelite elders think they are just asking for a political administrative upgrade.
So they're speaking two different languages, basically.
Exactly. Look closely at the exact phrasing they use when they approach Samuel. They say they want a king to govern them so that they can be like all the nations.
Ah, like the nations. That's the kicker.
That is the kicker. Because in the worldview of the biblical authors, Israel's entire reason for existing, going all the way back to their liberation from slavery in Egypt and the covenant they made at Mount Sinai, is that they are emphatically not supposed to be like the other nations.
They're supposed to be set apart.
Right. They're supposed to be unique covenant community. They're supposed to be directly, immediately ruled by YHWH. The text presents this demand for a human king as a direct rejection of divine kingship.
So it's an insult.
A huge insult. They're essentially standing there saying, look, the invisible God who rescued our ancestors is great in theory, but it isn't cutting it right now when the Philistine iron chariots are massing on our borders.
We need something real.
Yeah, they want a visible security blanket. They want a guy with a crown and a sword who they can physically point to.
They want the tangible over the transcendent.
Exactly.
But what I find so fascinating about this confrontation in 1 Samuel 8 is that Samuel doesn't just deliver a theological rebuke. He actually gives them a masterclass in ancient macroeconomics.
Oh yeah, he gets incredibly practical.
He really does. He lays out this incredibly bleak, granular forecast of what having a centralized monarchy actually costs. He says, essentially, you want a king, fine, but here is the fine print you are ignoring.
The fine print is always where they get you.
It is. He tells them that a king is going to take their sons and conscript them to run before his chariots. He's going to take their daughters to be his perfumers, his cooks, and his bakers.
He's detailing the royal household.
Right, and it gets worse. He's going to seize the absolute best of their fields, their vineyards, and their olive orchards, and he's going to give that generational land to his royal courtiers.
In taxes.
Massive taxes. He's going to demand a mandatory tenth of all their grain and their flocks. He is outlining the brutal realities of taxation, state bureaucracy, military conscription, and the extraction of civilian labor.
Yeah, he is describing the birth of the administrative state. And the socioeconomic context of ancient Israel makes this warning even more devastating.
How so?
Well, ancient Israel was an agrarian, kinship-based, honor-shame society. Your identity wasn't your job title, it was your family lineage and your ancestral land.
So taking the land is like taking their identity.
Exactly. That land was considered a divine inheritance entrusted to your specific clan. When you introduce a monarch who has the power to seize land and conscript labor, you are fundamentally altering and in many ways destroying that deeply egalitarian clan-based structure.
Wow, so it's a complete social upheaval.
A massive upheaval. You are creating a state apparatus that requires constant tribute just to keep the lights on in the palace. The people are voluntarily trading their freedom and their ancestral independence for the illusion of geopolitical security.
Man, it's exactly like a citizenry voting for a wildly charismatic politician because his speeches make them feel safe. But they completely ignore the massive tax hikes, the loss of civil liberties, and the crushing inflation that are buried on page 400 of his policy platform.
That's a perfect modern analogy, yeah.
But even with all these warnings, they double down. They demand the king. And the source material highlights a really vital linguistic reality about the kind of king they were supposed to get versus the kind they wanted.
Yeah, the Hebrew language itself embeds the political theology of this era.
Let's get into the words.
So when the biblical text talks about kingdom or reign, the word is malkut,
Malkut. Okay.
right? And the word for king is melech.
Got it.
Now, in the ancient Near East, in Egypt, in Babylon, the king was often viewed as divine, or at the very least, the absolute, unquestioned author of the law. His word was reality.
Whatever he says goes.
Exactly. But in the political theology of Israel, human kingship being a melech was only considered legitimate if it remained entirely subordinate to God's ultimate rule.
So they aren't the top of the pyramid.
No, not at all. The Israelite king was never supposed to be the author of the law. He was supposed to be the chief student and the most obedient servant of the Torah, the divine instruction.
Wow.
In fact, the book of Deuteronomy commands that the king is supposed to write out a personal copy of the law and read it every day of his life. The king rules under the law, never above it.
which is an incredibly radical limitation of executive power for the Iron Age. I mean, the king isn't a god. He's a citizen who has to read the exact same rulebook as the poorest peasant in the kingdom.
It's a completely unique political structure for that time.
So the people ignore Samuel's warnings. They demand their king, and God tells Samuel to give them what they want. Which brings us to the era we might call the Golden Age that wasn't the United Monarchy.
It's the big three.
Yeah, the big three. This is the period where all 12 tribes are actually unified under one central leader. We've got Saul, David, and Solomon. Let's start with Saul. He comes onto the historical stage around 1050 BCE.
Right. Saul is the tragic first attempted kingship, and he is exactly what the people asked for when they said they wanted a king like the nations.
He looks the part.
Oh, he completely looks the part. Physically, he is described as standing head and shoulders above everyone else. He is handsome. He is a formidable warrior king.
But there's a catch.
A huge catch. He has immense natural gifting, but psychologically the text paints him as deeply fundamentally insecure. Saul is the ultimate ancient case study in the imposter syndrome of leadership.
Man, he has the title, but he totally lacks the internal anchor. You read his story, and he constantly seems terrified of losing the crowd's approval.
And that is precisely his downfall. His narrative arc is a tragedy because whenever he faces a crisis, he prioritizes his public image and the morale of his troops over his obedience to the prophetic word of God.
Can you give an example from the source?
Yeah, there are instances where he is told to wait for Samuel before offering a sacrifice before a battle. But the troops start scattering because they're scared. So Saul panics and illegally offers the sacrifice himself just to keep his army from deserting.
Just trying to hold the coalition together.
Exactly. In another instance, he disobeys a direct command regarding the spoils of war because he wants to appease his soldiers who want the plunder.
He caves to peer pressure.
He does. Saul stands as this glaring permanent warning in the text. External charisma and military capability absolutely do not equal covenant fidelity. He has the crown, but he loses the divine endorsement because he refuses to submit to the constitutional rules of the covenant.
He can't handle being a king under authority.
No, he really can.
And when Saul's reign inevitably crashes and burns, the kingdom is thrust into this bloody transitional period that eventually leads to the ascension of the most famous king in all of biblical literature, David.
The man himself.
Right. He takes the throne and reigns roughly from 1010 to 970 BCE. David secures the borders, he captures Jerusalem and makes it his capital, and he is presented as the idealized quintessential king.
For the most part, yes.
Yeah, but before we get to his massive catastrophic flaws, and we have to look at 2 Samuel chapter 7. According to the source material, this single chapter is one of the most crucial foundational texts in the entire Hebrew Bible. What exactly is happening in this scene?
So, 2 Samuel 7 establishes the Davidic covenant. The historical context here is that David has finally achieved rest from his enemies. He has conquered Jerusalem. He has built himself a beautiful, opulent palace made of imported cedar wood.
He's comfortable.
Very comfortable. And he looks out from his palace and sees that the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israel, the symbol of God's presence, is still sitting in a temporary fabric tent.
Oh, right.
So David calls in the prophet Nathan and says, "Look, I live in a house of cedar, but the Ark of God dwells in a tent. I want to build a house for God." He wants to build a permanent stone temple.
Which, politically speaking, is exactly what an ancient Near Eastern king is supposed to do. You consolidate power, you build your capital, and then you build a massive temple for your patron deity to prove that the gods endorse your regime.
Exactly. It's statecraft 101.
Right.
But God's response, delivered through the prophet Nathan, is a stunning divine reversal. And here's where it gets really interesting. It turns on a brilliant piece of Hebrew wordplay revolving around the word bayit.
Bayit.
Yes, which means house. God says to David, "Are you going to build a house for me to live in?" "No, I'm going to make a house for you."
I love that.
It's brilliant because God isn't talking about masonry and cedar beams. He's using the word bayit to mean a dynasty, a royal lineage.
A house in the sense of the House of Windsor.
Exactly. God promises David that his throne, his lineage, and his kingdom will endure forever. It is an unconditional, unilateral promise from God to establish David's house perpetually.
It's a breathtaking promise, a permanent dynasty. But let's pause right here, because if you are reading this text objectively, you are going to slam right into a massive, glaring contradiction.
Oh, definitely.
David receives this eternal covenant. He is held up as the model king. And yet, just a few chapters later, in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, David commits some of the most horrific, calculated abuses of executive power imaginable.
The Bathsheba incident.
Yes, the story of Bathsheba. David is up on his palace roof. He sees a woman bathing. He uses his absolute royal power to send his guards to take her. When she becomes pregnant, David orchestrates a frantic, multi-layered military cover-up.
It's a full-on conspiracy.
It is. It ultimately results in David ordering his general to abandon Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, who is, by the way, one of David's most loyal elite soldiers on the front lines, so he will be slaughtered by the enemy.
Yeah, it's brutal.
This isn't just a minor administrative error. This is adultery, deception, and state-sponsored murder. In almost any modern institutional setting, a leader committing crimes even a fraction this egregious would result in their immediate permanent removal, massive legal prosecution, and the total erasure of their legacy.
They'd be canceled instantly, yeah.
Exactly, complete cancel culture. How in the world does the biblical text keep holding David up as the standard for kingship after he uses the state apparatus to murder an innocent man?
Well, it is one of the most profound tensions in the text, and it reveals everything about how the biblical writers measured leadership. First, it's vital to note that the text does not sanitize David's crimes.
Right, it puts it all out there.
Yeah, in many ancient royal annals, a king's failures are completely omitted, but the biblical narrative exposes David's depravity with brutal, uncompromising clarity.
So why is he still the model?
Because David's defining trait, the reason he is called the man after God's own heart, was not moral perfection or sinlessness. It was his response to prophetic confrontation.
Okay, tell us about the confrontation.
So, after the murder of Uriah, God sends the prophet Nathan to confront the king. Nathan tells a parable about a rich man stealing a poor man's lamb. David gets furious at the rich man, and then Nathan points the finger at the most powerful man in the kingdom and says, "You are the man."
Which is terrifying. I mean, think about what David could have done in that moment. He is the supreme autocrat. He could have just had Nathan executed on the spot for treason.
Easily.
He could have denied it. He could have had his PR team spin the narrative.
That is what any other ancient Near Eastern monarch would have done. But David doesn't. He collapses under the weight of his own guilt. His immediate response is, "I have sinned against YHWH."
He completely owns it.
He completely unequivocally repents. He strips off his royal dignity and fasts in ashes, and this highlights a structural, overarching theological theme of the entire monarchy narrative. Salvation, divine favor, and covenant legacy are not secured by dynastic privilege.
They aren't secured by maintaining a flawless record either.
No, they are secured by mercy, by sincere repentance, and by a willingness to submit to absolute accountability when you fail. David accepts the agonizing consequences of his actions, and the consequences for his family are horrific without ever abandoning his faith or blaming God.
He actually recognizes that fine print we talked about earlier. He remembered, even after breaking it, that he was a king under the law, not a god above it.
Exactly.
So David eventually grows old and dies. The throne passes to his son, Solomon, who reigns roughly from 970 to 931 BCE. Now, if David was the warrior who bled to secure the borders, Solomon is the administrator who builds the empire.
Yeah, Solomon is famous for his staggering splendor.
He really is. Under Solomon, Israel reaches its absolute zenith of geopolitical influence, and he finally builds that massive, glittering temple in Jerusalem that his father wanted to build. 1 Kings chapters 5 through 8 detail this astonishing architectural and engineering marvel.
The construction and the subsequent dedication of that temple in 1 Kings 8 is arguably the theological and historical high watermark of the entire Old Testament narrative.
The absolute peak.
Yeah. Solomon gathers the nation, and he offers this incredibly expansive, deeply humble prayer of dedication. He acknowledges right up front that the highest heavens cannot contain God, much less a building made of stone and cedar.
Right.
He asks that the temple simply serve as a focal point, a place where God will hear the prayers of the people, whether they are Israelites or foreigners, when they repent and turn toward it.
It's beautiful.
It is a moment of perfect, brilliant covenant alignment. The nation is secure, the temple is built, and the king is leading the people in the worship of YHWH. But the profound tragedy of Solomon is the slow, almost imperceptible drift that follows that high point.
Yeah, the drift is terrifying because it doesn't happen overnight. You read 1 Kings 11, and it's such a stark, depressing contrast to chapter 8. How does a guy who possessed the wisdom to pray that beautiful prayer end up so far off course? What is the mechanism of his downfall?
Well, the mechanism of his downfall is actually his unprecedented political and economic success.
Wait, his success?
Yes, his success. Solomon engages in massive, highly effective foreign diplomacy. And in the ancient world, you sealed diplomatic treaties through marriage alliances. So Solomon marries the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and he marries princesses from Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Sidon.
So he's building this massive coalition.
Exactly. He amasses unimaginable wealth. He builds massive standing armies of chariots, which, again, was explicitly forbidden for the king in Deuteronomy. And he creates a sprawling, opulent royal court.
He's breaking the rules, but it looks like it's working.
Right. And the text brilliantly shows us how a leader can be a geopolitical genius, an economic titan, and an administrative savant. But that very success can create a bubble of invincibility that completely blinds them to their own spiritual decay.
Because all those wives bring their own gods.
Exactly. His foreign wives naturally bring their own religious practices and entourages to Jerusalem. And Solomon, the man who built the magnificent temple for YHWH, gradually begins to build shrines in high places to foreign gods like Chemosh and Milcom, right across the valley from Jerusalem, to appease his political alliances.
Wow.
His heart, the text says, was turned away. It's a slow-motion catastrophe born of compromise in the name of political expediency.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the absolute disaster that follows. We are moving into the Great Fracture. Because Solomon's massive wealth, his golden shields, his ivory throne, his massive building projects, none of that just appeared out of thin air.
No, it didn't.
You don't build a glittering temple and a sprawling palace complex without someone footing the bill, and that bill was paid by the average Israelite citizen, specifically through a system of crushing taxation and forced labor known as the corvée.
Yeah, the corvée labor system.
Solomon essentially took Samuel's warning from chapter 8 and instituted it as national policy. He turned his own people, especially the northern tribes, into an ATM and a free workforce. He drafted tens of thousands of Israelites to work in the stone quarries and the cedar forests of Lebanon.
It was backbreaking.
And that deep, simmering economic resentment directly triggers a catastrophic national schism.
The tension was completely unsustainable, and the chickens come home to roost the very moment Solomon dies. We are now looking at 1 Kings chapter 12, around the year 930 BCE.
Enter Rehoboam.
Right, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, is preparing to take the throne. The leaders of the northern tribes, who have borne the absolute brunt of this forced labor system for decades, come to him at Shechem.
And they have a leader, right?
Yes, they are led by a man named Jeroboam, who was actually a former labor foreman under Solomon. They present Rehoboam with a completely reasonable, pragmatic political petition.
What do they ask for?
They say, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, and we will serve you." They're basically asking for tax relief and an end to the forced labor camps.
Which seems entirely fair. And Rehoboam, in one of the most stunningly arrogant blunders in political history, takes the absolute worst advice possible.
It's painful to read.
It is. The text says he consults with the older, wiser advisors who served his father. They tell him, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them, they will be your servants forever. It's brilliant advice. But Rehoboam rejects it.
He ignores the seasoned experts.
Totally. Instead, he turns to the young men he grew up with, the kids who were raised in the opulent palace bubble, who have no idea what it's like to haul stone in a quarry. And they basically tell him to double down, project absolute dominance, and show the peasants who is boss.
The ultimate echo chamber.
Yes. So Rehoboam goes back to the northern leaders and delivers this infamous line, "My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." It is a masterclass in how to completely destroy a nation with a single sentence.
And that single sentence shatters the fragile unity of the 12 tribes instantly and permanently.
They are done.
They are out. The northern tribes immediately respond with a chant of secession. What portion do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel. The kingdom splits right down the middle.
So now we have two kingdoms.
Exactly. You now have 10 tribes in the north, which retain the name Israel, and they crown Jeroboam as their king. And you have the south, which becomes the kingdom of Judah, consisting mainly of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, remaining loyal to Rehoboam and the Davidic line.
Okay.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this wasn't just a political secession over tax policy. The biblical authors view this primarily as a liturgical rebellion.
Liturgical rebellion. Let's break down that phrase, because you really have to understand the map logic and the geography of the Levant to grasp why the rest of this history plays out the way it does.
Geography is destiny here.
For sure. You have the north, Israel, with its capital eventually settling in Samaria. Geographically, it is wealthier. It has a much larger population. It has the lush, fertile agricultural land of the Jezreel Valley, and it controls the major international trade routes.
They've got the resources.
They do, but politically, it is wildly unstable. Without the anchor of the Davidic promise, dynasties in the north are going to rise and fall through bloody assassinations constantly over the next 2 centuries.
It's a revolving door of kings.
Yeah. Then you have the south, Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem. Geographically, it's much smaller. It's rugged, rocky hill country, isolated off the main trade routes. But it holds two massive, unquantifiable bases. It has the unbroken, divinely endorsed Davidic lineage, and it has the temple.
Right. And that temple in Jerusalem is an immediate existential threat to Jeroboam up in the north. We have to remember that religion in the ancient Near East was not a matter of private, internal spirituality that you practiced in your living room.
It wasn't just what you believed in your heart.
Not at all. It was deeply national, public, and central to civic and political identity. Jeroboam realizes that if his newly independent northern citizens keep traveling south across the border to Jerusalem 3 times a year to offer sacrifices and celebrate the major religious festivals at Solomon's temple, their political loyalty will eventually follow their religious practice.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, they will be mingling with Judeans, seeing the Davidic king, and eventually they will just reunite with the south and probably assassinate Jeroboam in the process. He has a massive border control problem based entirely on liturgy.
So what's his solution?
So he has to create a compelling, accessible religious alternative to keep his people in the north. He sets up 2 rival religious centers at the extreme northern and southern borders of his new kingdom, one at Dan and one at Bethel. And he installs golden calves at these sites.
Golden calves, which is just wild. I mean, you don't need a PhD in biblical studies to know that whenever golden calves show up in the biblical narrative going all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai, it is going to be an unmitigated disaster.
Yeah, it's a huge red flag.
Huge. Jeroboam literally repeats the exact phrasing from Exodus, saying, "Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt."
It's a direct copy-paste of a terrible idea.
But setting up these rival shrines perfectly explains a recurring theme in the text that used to constantly confuse me. If you read through the Book of Kings, constantly, even when the narrator is praising one of the good kings of Judah, they almost always throw in the specific caveat. But the high places were not removed. Why is the text so obsessively focused on these local shrines?
Well, the high places, or Bamat in Hebrew, were local, elevated, open-air sites of worship spread throughout the countryside.
Just local neighborhood altars.
Basically, yeah. Before Solomon's temple was built, worship at these local sites was somewhat tolerated because there was no central sanctuary. But once the temple in Jerusalem was dedicated as the singular, divinely chosen place for the covenant community to gather and offer sacrifice, these local shrines became a massive theological threat.
Because they decentralized things.
Because they decentralized the religion, yes. They made it incredibly easy for syncretism to creep in.
Syncretism being the blending of different religions.
Exactly. When you are worshiping at a local high place, miles away from the oversight of the Levitical priests in Jerusalem, it becomes very tempting to mix the worship of YHWH with the worship of local Canaanite agricultural deities.
You just kind of blend it all together.
Right. You start hedging your bets. You worship YHWH for national deliverance, but you offer sacrifice to Baal, the storm god, to make sure it rains on your crops, and you worship Asherah, the mother goddess, for fertility.
So you cover all your bases.
Exactly. But to the historians compiling these books, failing to centralize worship in Jerusalem was a failure to protect the pure, uncompromising covenantal identity of the nation.
And Jeroboam made it official state policy.
He did. Jeroboam's deliberate institutional establishment of these alternate shrines at Dan and Bethel is viewed as the original unpardonable sin of the northern kingdom. It is a toxic shadow that hangs over every subsequent northern king until their absolute destruction. The text repeatedly says of later kings, "He walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin which he made Israel to sin."
So we have a deeply fractured world. We have kings in the north who are institutionally committed to this liturgical rebellion just to maintain their political power. And we have kings in the south who, despite having the temple, are constantly wrestling with the temptation to rely on foreign military alliances and local high places rather than trusting God.
It's a mess.
It is a total mess.
Agreed.
And with the executive branch behaving so badly across the board, a new power dynamic has to emerge in the society to keep these monarchs in check. And that brings us to the rise of the prophets.
Ah, the prophets.
Now, when you say the word prophet today, the modern mind instantly imagines someone gazing into a crystal ball, predicting the end of the world, or maybe some eccentric hermit wearing a sandwich board shouting on a street corner. But that is completely divorced from what these figures were actually doing in ancient Israel.
Yeah, the modern misconception of the prophet is a huge hurdle to understanding this literature. The Hebrew term is nabi. We really need to redefine that word for this historical context. They are absolutely not fortune tellers or mystic diviners.
So what are they?
Well, in the pagan nations surrounding Israel, kings had diviners who would read sheep livers or observe the stars to predict whether a military campaign would be successful. The biblical prophet is doing something entirely different. The best way to understand them, as the source material brilliantly highlights, is as covenant prosecutors.
Covenant prosecutors.
Yes, they are the prosecuting attorneys of the divine court. Remember our premise from earlier. The king is supposed to be ruling under the constitution of the Torah.
Right, the king is under the law.
Exactly. When the king starts violating those laws, when he starts worshiping foreign gods, exploiting the poor, or stealing lands, the prophet is the official dispatched by the true king, YHWH, to serve the subpoena.
You've been served.
Literally. They embody the word of God against royal idolatry and systemic injustice. They're the ultimate, fiercely independent check and balance on absolute executive power.
Covenant prosecutors. That perfectly captures their role. And there is absolutely no better, more visceral example of this dynamic than the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21.
Well, that's a classic text.
I want to recount this narrative in detail because it brilliantly illustrates everything we've been talking about regarding power, land, and the prophetic role. You have King Ahab, who is ruling the northern kingdom of Israel. He is married to Queen Jezebel. Ahab is in his palace in Jezreel. He looks out his window, and he decides he wants the vineyard right next door so he can turn it into a vegetable garden.
Just a little home improvement project for the king.
Exactly. The vineyard belongs to a local citizen named Naboth. So Ahab goes to Naboth and makes what, to a modern ear, sounds like a very fair, above-board real estate offer. He says, I'll buy it from you for a good price, or I'll trade you an even better vineyard in a different location.
Sounds reasonable enough today.
Right. But Naboth flatly refuses. And he doesn't refuse because he's holding out for more money. He refuses based on ancient kinship and ancestral land laws. He tells the king, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors. Because in their culture, land wasn't just commercial real estate you could flip for a profit. It was your family's permanent divine inheritance within the covenant.
Yeah, that is a critical point. According to the book of Leviticus, the land ultimately belonged to God, and the Israelite families were essentially tenant farmers. The land was tied to their tribal identity in perpetuity.
So selling it is a huge deal.
It's massive. If you sold your ancestral land permanently, you were essentially erasing your family's name from the covenant community. It could not simply be sold off to the state.
Okay, so Ahab, who is an Israelite king and knows the Torah, actually accepts this. He goes home, lies down on his bed, turns his face to the wall, and sulks like a teenager.
He literally pouts.
He does. He is depressed, but he knows Naboth is legally and theologically in the right. But his wife, Jezebel, represents a completely different political worldview. She comes from a Phoenician royal background where kings possess absolute, unchecked autocratic power.
A different paradigm entirely.
Totally. A Phoenician king doesn't ask a peasant for land, he just takes it. So she sees her husband sulking and she mocks him. She says, are you the king of Israel or not? Get up and eat. I will get you the vineyard.
She takes matters into her own hands.
And in the worst way. She then proceeds to use the Israelite legal system against itself. She writes letters in Ahab's name, uses his royal seal, and orchestrates a sham trial. She hires 2 false witnesses to publicly accuse Naboth of cursing God and the king. Naboth is dragged outside the city and stoned to death.
It's horrific.
And once he's dead, Ahab casually strolls down to take possession of the newly vacant vineyard.
It's an absolutely chilling abuse of power.
To bring this into a modern context, imagine a billionaire tech CEO who decides he wants to build a new, sprawling private parking lot for his corporate headquarters. But there is a generational family farm sitting right in the middle of his planned lot.
Okay, I see where this is going.
The family refuses to sell no matter the price because their great-great-grandfather built the farmhouse with his own hands. So the billionaire doesn't just walk away. Instead, he uses his massive wealth to bribe local politicians, manipulate eminent domain laws, completely bankrupt the family through frivolous, endless legal fees, and ultimately has the local sheriff evict them and bulldoze the house.
That's spot on.
It's the exact same power dynamic. It is wealth and executive power rewriting the rules of reality to crush the powerless.
And that is exactly why this specific story matters so deeply to the overarching narrative of the monarchy. Kingship, just as Samuel warned back in chapter 8, inevitably alters the clan-based social structures and creates severe, brutal class stratification.
You get the haves and the have-nots.
You end up with a wealthy, immune elite clustered around the palace and a marginalized, exploited peasantry. But the prophets serve as the countermeasure. In this story, the prophet Elijah is immediately sent by God to confront Ahab.
Ah, here comes the prosecutor.
Exactly. He intercepts Ahab in the very vineyard he just stole. Elijah's presence proves that kingship rapidly devolves into legalized theft when power severs itself from the Torah. Elijah steps into that vineyard to remind the king that he is entirely accountable to the law.
Ahab probably thought he was in the clear. He totally thought he got away with murder because he used the official state apparatus, a legal trial, to do it. Elijah shows up to tell him that the true king saw the entire charade and that divine judgment is coming for his entire dynasty.
Wow. Okay. So we have all these sprawling, epic stories. We have shifting borders, kings stealing vineyards, prophets calling down fire and judgment, massive military campaigns, and geopolitical maneuvering. It makes for incredible, gripping reading.
It really does.
But at some point, if you were listening to this, you have to ask the critical, skeptical question. Is this just an epic myth? Are we reading historical fiction? Or are we reading actual history? Did Ahab and David actually walk the earth? Where's the physical proof? Let's look at the archaeological evidence.
That is the absolute crucial question for any historical survey. And the source material we are looking at provides a very balanced, nuanced, scholarly view on this. The consensus among archaeologists and historians is divided based on the era.
Okay, break that down for us. Well, when it comes to the divided monarchy, the later periods of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, roughly the 9th, 8th, and 7th centuries BCE, the archaeological backing is incredibly strong, almost overwhelming. We have an abundance of material evidence, inscriptions, and corroborating texts from other empires.
So the later stuff is pretty locked in.
Very locked in. However, the united monarchy of the 10th century BCE, the era of David and Solomon, is heavily debated regarding its scale. We don't have large bodies of contemporary written material from the 10th century in the Levant.
So we're kind of in the dark.
A bit, yes. So some scholars, often called maximalists, view David's kingdom as a massive, centralized empire, exactly as described in the text. Others, often called minimalists, argue it was a much more modest, localized chiefdom that was later embellished and idealized by later writers.
Right.
But what is fascinating is that the existence of the Davidic dynasty itself is not really in question anymore, thanks to some truly spectacular discoveries.
Right. Let's pull out the receipts. Let's talk about how we actually know this stuff, because the process of these discoveries is thrilling. Instead of just listing artifacts, picture the scene. I'll let you start with the big one. The discovery that essentially ended the debate about whether King David was just a myth like King Arthur.
Oh, that would be the Tel Dan Stele. Picture an archaeological dig in 1993 in northern Israel at a site called Tel Dan. Archaeologists are excavating the ruins of an ancient city gate, and they find a broken piece of basalt stone that had been smashed and reused as a paving stone in a later wall.
Just a random rock in a wall.
Just a random rock. But when they clean it off, they realize it has writing on it. It dates to the 9th century BCE, and it is a piece of a victory monument erected by an Aramean king, likely King Hazael of Damascus, boasting about his military victories over his enemies.
Like an ancient billboard.
Exactly. And right there, carved into the stone in Aramaic, he claims to have killed the king of Israel and a king of the house of David by to it in the inscription.
Wait, really? The house of David?
Yes. Until that exact moment, skeptics could, and did, argue that David was entirely fictional. That one broken rock completely rewrote modern history books. It is widely regarded as the earliest extra-biblical reference to the Davidic dynasty.
That is wild.
Now, it doesn't prove the exact size of David's empire a century earlier, but it absolutely, physically confirms the historicity of a dynastic line tracing its origin to a historical figure named David, a lineage so famous it was recognized by rival nations.
It gives you chills to think about dusting off a rock and seeing that name. Okay, my absolute favorite artifact on this list is the Sennacherib prism, which dates to 691 BCE.
Oh, that's a fantastic one.
It's so cool. We actually have multiple perfectly preserved copies of this clay prism. You can see them in the British Museum and the Israel Museum. This artifact perfectly aligns with the events described in 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19. The context is terrifying.
Yep.
You have the massive, brutal Assyrian Empire sweeping through the Middle East.
They were terrifying.
They are the apex predators of the ancient world. They wipe out cities, and they march south and lay siege to Jerusalem, where Judah's king Hezekiah is trapped inside. The biblical text describes this horrific, claustrophobic standoff, with Assyrian officials outside the walls screaming psychological warfare at the people on the wall.
Right, trying to get them to surrender.
Exactly. And then we dig up the official royal annals of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. It is a hexagonal clay prism covered in tiny cuneiform script, and it is a piece of pure, distilled imperial propaganda.
Oh, it's totally spinning the story.
Totally. Sennacherib brags about destroying 46 of Judah's walled cities, and then he writes regarding Hezekiah that he shut him up in Jerusalem like a caged bird.
Like a caged bird.
Yes. He perfectly, explicitly corroborates the geopolitical tension, the specific king, and the reality of the siege. Now, what is hilarious is that Sennacherib doesn't mention that his army was mysteriously decimated overnight, and he had to retreat in disgrace without actually taking the city, which the Bible records, because ancient kings didn't engrave their massive military failures on their victory prism.
No, you only carve the wins.
Right. But the alignment of the historical setting is flawless.
And that very same siege gives us another spectacular piece of physical evidence that you can literally touch today. Hezekiah's tunnel and the Siloam inscription.
Oh, tell me about that tunnel.
The biblical text tells us that as Hezekiah prepared for this terrifying Assyrian siege, he knew his biggest vulnerability was water. The mainspring was outside the city walls, so he ordered a massive engineering project, blocking the outside springs and carving a tunnel through solid bedrock to bring the water supply safely inside the walls of Jerusalem.
That sounds impossible back then.
It was incredibly difficult, but today you can travel to Jerusalem, put on water shoes, and walk through that exact late 8th century BCE water system. You can see the chisel marks.
Wow.
And when it was first explored in the 19th century, they found an inscription carved into the wall by the ancient engineers. It vividly details how the two teams of diggers started from opposite ends, swinging their axes, listening for the sound of each other's voices through the rock until they finally broke through and the water flowed.
So it completely backs up the text.
It strongly, undeniably confirms the biblical accounts of the urgent urban preparations for that exact historical crisis.
It's mind-blowing that you can wade through a piece of biblical history like that. But we should also note that not all the archaeology just confirms the heroic or positive parts of the story. There is a deeply controversial find mentioned in the sources, the Kuntalet Arjud inscriptions. What is the significance of this site, and what does it tell us about the actual religious lives of the people?
Well, Kuntalet Ojrud is an 8th century BCE site located in the desolate northeastern Sinai Peninsula. It was likely a way station for travelers. The artifacts found there include large pottery jars called pithoi, covered in drawings and inscriptions.
What do the inscriptions say?
And they are fascinating because the inscriptions contain blessings invoked in the name of Yahweh of Samaria and Yahweh of Taman. But critically, they also include explicit references to his Asherah.
His Asherah.
Yes. Asherah, as we mentioned earlier, was a prominent Canaanite mother goddess, often associated with fertility and sacred trees. What this archaeological find proves is that on the ground, away from the official Orthodox theology of the temple priests in Jerusalem, the popular religion of the everyday Israelites was incredibly mixed and syncretistic.
So they were doing exactly what the prophets yelled at them for doing.
Exactly. They were literally blending the worship of YHWH with Canaanite fertility deities. It provides immense physical validation for the constant anger and frustration we see from the biblical prophets. When the prophets are screaming about idolatry, they aren't just complaining about a minor theoretical issue. They are fighting an entrenched, on-the-ground reality of widespread theological compromise.
Which perfectly, tragically transitions us into the final act of this history. Because all of this archaeological tension we just talked about, the crushing pressure from the Assyrian war machine, the terrifying sieges, the deeply ingrained syncretism and idol worship, it all points to an unavoidable catastrophic climax.
The end is near.
The great empires of the world are knocking at the door with battering rams, and the Israelite kingdoms are crumbling from within.
The fall is staggering, and it happens in two phases. It begins with the north. In 722 or 721 BCE, the Assyrian Empire finally crushes the northern kingdom of Israel. Samaria, the capital, falls after a brutal siege.
And what happens to the people?
The Assyrian policy for conquered nations was psychological and demographic terror. They deported the surviving population and scattered them across their empire, replacing them with foreigners, completely erasing their national identity. This is the end of the 10 northern tribes as an independent state.
They're just gone.
Gone. 2 Kings chapter 17 provides the theological autopsy for this horrifying event. The narrator steps back from the historical action and makes the meaning very clear. To paraphrase, they argue, this didn't happen just because Assyria had better chariots or superior tactics.
Why did it happen then?
It happened because the children of Israel had systemically sinned against the Lord. They had built high places, set up sacred pillars, worshipped idols, and relentlessly ignored the warnings of the prophets. It was a complete systemic covenant failure, and the result was exile.
So the north is gone, wiped off the map.
Yeah.
But Judah, the southern kingdom, survives. They hang on for over a century longer.
By the skin of their teeth.
Truly. And as the source points out, part of that survival is geography. Jerusalem is nestled in the mountains and much harder to besiege, and part of it is that they managed a delicate, desperate diplomatic dance with these empires. But they also had a couple of reforming kings who tried to pull the nation back from the brink.
Right, the bright spots.
Yeah, you have Hezekiah, who survived the Assyrian siege, and later you have King Josiah. The story of Josiah in 2 Kings 22 and 23 is one of the most poignant moments in the entire text.
It's heartbreaking, really.
It is. Josiah is a young king, and he orders renovations for the temple, which has fallen into disrepair. During the renovations, the high priest actually finds a lost scroll of the Book of the Law, likely a portion of Deuteronomy buried in the rubble.
They had literally lost the Bible in the temple.
Exactly. They read it to Josiah, and he literally tears his clothes in despair because he realizes how far the nation has drifted from the covenant. He institutes a massive, sweeping reform. He tears down the high places, smashes the idols, and tries to force the nation back to YHWH.
He goes all in.
He does. It's like trying to save a massive ship that has already taken on 1 million gallons of water. Josiah is up on deck, polishing the brass, resetting the sails, throwing cargo overboard, and putting everything in perfect order, and he does a brilliant, heroic job, but the hull is completely missing. The momentum toward the ocean floor is already locked in.
That is exactly the dynamic. Josiah's reforms are praised as the highest standard of covenant loyalty since David. But the text is explicit that the theological momentum toward destruction was already irreversible.
So it was too late.
It was too late. And this raises an important question for the reader. If Josiah was so good, why did the South ultimately fall?
What's the catalyst?
Well, in 586 BCE, a new empire, the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar, breached the walls of Jerusalem after a horrific starving siege. They burned the city to the ground. They completely dismantle and destroy Solomon's magnificent temple.
The temple is gone.
Gone. They capture the last Davidic king, Zedekiah, force him to watch his sons be executed, then blind him, put him in chains, and lead the surviving population away into exile in Babylon. It is the absolute devastating end of the monarchy, the loss of the promised land and the loss of the temple. It is a complete reversal of the Exodus.
So they're back in captivity.
Exactly. The authors of this history, often called the Deuteronomistic historians, because they judged every event based on the covenant laws in the book of Deuteronomy, explain this devastation not as a sign that YHWH was weaker than the Babylonian god Marduk.
So it wasn't a battle of the gods.
No, rather this was a profound, justified covenant judgment. The narrator points specifically to the extreme apostasy of King Manasseh, Josiah's grandfather, who had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, practiced child sacrifice, and erected altars to foreign gods right inside the temple courtyards.
Oh, that's incredibly dark.
It is. The monarchy ends because of persistent, unrepented systemic sin. The covenant at Sinai had curses attached to it for absolute disobedience, and 586 BCE was the terrifying execution of that curse.
So we arrive at the ruins of Jerusalem. The temple is ashes. The king is blinded and in chains. The people are weeping by the rivers of Babylon. It is a bleak, devastating scene.
The lowest point possible.
Absolutely. So what does this all mean? We've spent this time tracing the rise and fall of these ancient political structures. Why should you, listening to this right now, care about the collapse of an Iron Age kingdom?
You should care, because human nature hasn't evolved a single inch since 1 Samuel.
That is the truth.
The practical theology embedded in this history is razor sharp. First, as the source notes, This is highly anti-celebrity literature. It aggressively warns us that you can have leaders with immense gifting, incredible charisma, and brilliant administrative skills. But if they lack foundational moral accountability, they will ultimately destroy the very people they are supposed to protect.
It's all hollow.
Exactly. It shows us that institutions, whether they are governments, massive corporations, or global organizations, can look incredibly strong, wealthy, and powerful on the outside, while their internal structures are entirely corrupt and hollow.
It's a shiny veneer.
Yeah, it speaks directly to the dangers of the cult of personality, the allure of nationalism, and the inescapable truth that the private, unrepented sins of leadership always, eventually, have devastating, cascading public effects.
That is a sobering takeaway for anyone in leadership today. But this document isn't just a manual on political ethics or a cautionary tale about absolute power. It is part of a larger, redemptive historical arc that spans the entire Bible.
It's a piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Right. So I have to ask, how does this massive, multi-century failure of human kingship fit into the rest of the biblical story? Because if the Bible ended at 2 Kings chapter 25 with everyone in chains in Babylon, it would be the most depressing book ever written.
It would be a tragedy of cosmic proportions.
Hmm.
But the era of the monarchy functions as a massive, centuries-long theological test case.
What were they testing?
The overarching question being tested was this.
Yeah.
Can a human king, even one specifically anointed by God, placed in the promised land, and given a perfect set of constitutional laws, perfectly keep the covenant and secure the ultimate blessing for the people?
And the answer?
The historical answer of the Old Testament is a resounding, agonizing no. Every single king, even the best ones like David, Hezekiah, and Josiah, ultimately fall short. They all succumb to pride, compromise, or outright idolatry.
Nobody passes the test.
Nobody. And this complete systemic failure of human kingship creates a massive theological vacuum in the text. It leaves a gaping hole in the narrative. Because remember, God promised David in 2 Samuel 7 that his throne would endure forever. But now the throne is completely empty, the palace is burned, and the king is a prisoner in Babylon.
Right. The promise to David was unconditional in its longevity, so there is an agonizing tension. God's promise seems to have failed. And that tension, that unfulfilled expectation, is exactly what the New Testament steps in to resolve hundreds of years later.
Precisely. The failure of the monarchy generates this intense, burning messianic expectation that sustains the Jewish people through centuries of exile and foreign occupation. The pattern established in the Old Testament, the idea of an anointed king who faces conflict, undergoes profound suffering, receives ultimate vindication, and establishes an eternal kingdom is first embedded in the life of David.
That doesn't end with David.
No, it is always looking forward to a greater fulfillment. When you open the New Testament, the very first verse of Matthew's Gospel doesn't start with theology, it starts with lineage. It introduces Jesus immediately as the son of David.
Tying it right back to that promise.
Exactly. In the Gospel of Luke, the angel Gabriel tells Mary that her son will be given the throne of his father David, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Jesus is presented by the New Testament writers as the ultimate true king who steps into that historical vacuum.
He's the one who finally passes the test.
Yes. He is the king who actually obeys the Torah perfectly.
Oh.
Think about the contrast. The Old Testament kings extracted taxes, labor, and even the lives of their subjects to build their own empires. Jesus is presented as the king who gives his own life to ransom his subjects.
A total inversion of power.
Completely. He is the one who builds the true spiritual temple and who brings the promised covenant blessing not just to a single ancient tribe in the Levant, but to all nations. The dark, catastrophic failure of the Old Testament kings is the necessary backdrop that makes the arrival of the true king shine so brightly.
Which is such a masterful, cohesive way to pull all of these disparate historical threads together. So, to summarize the incredible sprawling journey we have been on in this deep dive, we watched a loose, terrified tribal confederation look at their neighbors and demand a visible king.
We saw the tragic rise and fall of Saul.
Right. And the deeply flawed but repentant heart of David, and the glittering, blinding heights of Solomon's wealth. We watched the kingdom fracture under the weight of its own economic greed, plunging into centuries of liturgical rebellion and fierce prophetic battles.
And finally, we stood in the rubble of Jerusalem in 586 BCE.
Watching the people being marched away into Babylonian exile. It is an astonishingly dramatic, psychologically rich, and profoundly relevant history.
It truly is. And yet, before we close, there is one final, incredibly subtle, almost easily missed detail in the text that we have to mention.
Oh, I know what you're going to say. Let's hear it.
It is the very last paragraph of the book of 2 Kings, chapter 25, verses 27 through 30. The narrator has just spent chapters describing the absolute horror of the siege, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the bleak reality of the exile. But then, right before the scroll ends, he adds this strange, tiny historical footnote.
A little post-credits scene.
Basically, yeah. He records that the exiled Davidic king, Jehoiachin, who has been rotting in a dark Babylonian prison for 37 years, is suddenly released. The new Babylonian king brings him out of prison, gives him new clothes, and gives him a permanent elevated seat of honor at the royal table for the rest of his life.
It's such a incredibly specific, quiet detail to end on after all that bloodshed. Why include that? What I want you to chew on as we wrap up today is this. Even in the absolute darkest moment of complete institutional collapse, when the temple is gone, the land is lost, and divine judgment has completely leveled everything they built, the text absolutely refuses to let the story end in total darkness.
It leaves a tiny, unresolved ember of hope burning.
That empty chair at the Babylonian table, newly occupied by a living descendant of David, is a quiet, powerful signal that the promise hasn't been annihilated. God hasn't forgotten the covenant. So I leave you with this final thought to mull over. In our own lives and in our own times, when the structures, the careers, or the institutions we've built fail entirely and the world seems to be crumbling into ash, where do we look to find that enduring ember of promise? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been an absolute privilege to explore this ancient world with you. We will catch you on the next one.